It wasn't the crash that raised questions. It was how it happened. A quiet Florida highway, a couple inside the car, and a moment that no one else saw. When first responders reached the wreck on I-95, they found Daniel Waterman and Leigha Mumby, both alive, both barely conscious, both pulled from a vehicle that shouldn't have gone off the road in those circumstances. There were no witnesses, no weather issues, and no clear reason it left its lane. At first, investigators logged it as another high-speed collision, but what they found over the next few weeks didn't match the word accident. There was no clear sign of evasive action, no outside cause, and no reason the impact had been so violent. Behind closed doors, detectives began to treat the case differently, not as bad luck, but as something that might carry intent. What began as a rescue would turn into one of Florida's most contested investigations, a story of a couple, a crash, and a question the law still hasn't fully answered. Because if evidence can tell you what happened, but not why it happened, how do you decide whether it was tragedy or intent? And was it really an accident, or the final act of a betrayal that no one saw coming?
You are watching Crime Insider. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video.
On February 9, 2025, at 3:12 a.m., emergency dispatch received a single-vehicle crash report on Interstate 95 near Palm Coast Parkway in Florida. Responders arrived to find a white car split against a tree in the median. The front end was crushed, airbags deployed, and both occupants were unresponsive. According to the Florida Highway Patrol report, the car had been traveling above 90 miles per hour. Investigators documented a clean stretch of asphalt behind the impact site. No tire friction, no sign of braking. The event data recorder later confirmed what the road already showed: full acceleration in the final seconds before collision. Fire rescue personnel pulled the two occupants from the wreck. The driver was identified as Leigha Mumby, 24. In the passenger seat was Daniel Waterman, 22. Both were airlifted to Halifax Health Medical Center in Daytona Beach with critical injuries. Paramedics noted the seatbelt burns and airbag deployment were consistent with high-velocity impact, not evasive loss of control. By sunrise, traffic investigators began mapping the scene. They photographed the absence of skid marks, measured gouge depth, and downloaded vehicle data directly from the car's onboard module. The readings showed throttle input at 100% until the moment power cut. To FHP analysts, that finding shifted the classification from a standard accident review to a potential intentional act. The road shoulders were clear of debris, and no other vehicle was involved. Witness statements collected from passing motorists described seeing taillights drifting from the lane moments before the crash, followed by a sudden explosion of sparks. One caller told dispatchers, "It didn't look like she even tried to slow down." Investigators sealed the wreck for forensic reconstruction and subpoenaed both occupants' mobile phones. Detectives began reviewing digital timelines to determine why the vehicle accelerated rather than braked. At that early stage, the case remained logged as a traffic collision. No charges were filed, and the driver's condition prevented immediate questioning. But among the evidence technicians and troopers on scene, the data raised an unspoken contradiction. The physics of the crash didn't match the paperwork. An accident record was being written about something that might not have been accidental at all. For now, the investigation would stay within highway jurisdiction. Two people were in critical care. One of them, still alive but unconscious, held answers that the system hadn't yet classified as evidence. And beneath the procedural calm of a routine crash report, the first outline of injustice had already begun, a case recorded as mechanical failure when the machine had done exactly what it was told to do. By mid-morning, both survivors were in intensive care at Halifax Health. Investigators worked to identify their families and obtain medical clearance to conduct interviews once either regained consciousness. The Florida Highway Patrol had not yet reclassified the crash. On paper, it was still a high-speed collision with injuries. Off record, detectives had already marked it for follow-up. According to medical intake documents, the passenger was Daniel Waterman, 22 years old. Originally from New York, he had moved to Florida less than a year earlier for work in construction and property maintenance. Employment records show he was scheduled to begin a new contract in Palm Coast the following week. Family members told local outlets that he had been planning to settle permanently and had recently learned he would become a father. The driver, Leigha Mumby, 24, was listed as Daniel's girlfriend. Hospital staff noted that she was pregnant and treated for internal injuries, including a fractured femur. Social media posts reviewed later by investigators documented their relationship over roughly 8 months. They had shared photographs from beaches, restaurant outings, and routine daily life, nothing to indicate volatility. Detectives began building a relational timeline to understand how two people known to be close ended up in a near-fatal crash. Phone subscriber data confirmed frequent calls between them in the days leading up to February 9th. No domestic violence reports, prior arrests, or restraining orders existed in any jurisdiction linked to their names. For investigators, that absence complicated motive. Without a documented pattern of conflict, intent was harder to define. Friends later interviewed by the state attorney's office described the pair as sometimes intense, but not violent. Several mentioned growing arguments during January, mostly about financial strain and uncertainty about the pregnancy. None described threats or physical altercations. Each account added fragments of tension, but nothing that, by itself, would predict a 90-mile-per-hour impact. According to statements summarized in the preliminary case file, Daniel had been renting a small apartment in Palm Coast, while Leigha remained intermittently between that address and a relative's home in Volusia County. Texts obtained from Daniel's phone show routine communication about errands and appointments through the afternoon before the crash. At 9:48 p.m., he messaged a co-worker confirming he would report to work Monday morning. By midnight, both phones were moving south on I-95, the last verified data points before collision. As the highway team documented mechanical readings, analysts in the digital forensics unit began extracting message histories. That process would later reveal material prosecutors considered central to the case. But at this stage, investigators could only categorize the event as an anomaly, a couple with no criminal record, a destroyed vehicle, and acceleration data inconsistent with loss of control. Family members arrived within 48 hours. Court filings show Daniel's parents authorized the release of medical information to law enforcement. They later told Fox 35 Orlando that doctors warned survival was uncertain. For them, the crash was a medical emergency. For detectives, it was an open question whether the same person who survived beside him had caused it. Through the week, news outlets repeated official phrasing, single vehicle accident, too critical. Behind those headlines, investigators were preparing to question the driver as soon as her condition allowed. What they needed to know was why the car never slowed down. And that answer, they suspected, might exist not in the wreckage, but in the last conversation between the two people inside it. In the days after the crash, the Florida Highway Patrol's digital forensics team finished extracting data from both phones. Investigators matched location pings and text logs minute by minute, reconstructing the hours that led to the collision. Those records, later summarized in the probable cause affidavit, outlined the argument that occurred inside the car. According to prosecutors, Daniel and Leigha had been at her relative's home earlier that evening. Witness statements placed them leaving around midnight. At 12:37 a.m., Daniel texted a coworker confirming he would arrive early to his job site. 5 minutes later, Leigha's phone sent a message to him from the passenger list of recent contacts, a short text asking why he had received a message from another woman in New York. That exchange marked the start of a conversation that would continue through the final half hour before the crash. Forensic analysts recovered over 40 messages between 12:40 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. Investigators say the tone escalated quickly, from questions about trust to accusations of betrayal. One text from Daniel read, "We can talk at home. Just drive safe." At 1:51 a.m., Leigha replied with a line cited repeatedly in filings, "You'll get what you deserve." Event data later confirmed the vehicle entered I-95 southbound just after 2 a.m. The GPS trace placed it moving through Palm Coast, reaching speeds between 85 and 92 miles per hour. By 3:11 a.m., the throttle was still fully engaged. FHP records show zero brake application in the final 6 seconds before impact. The car left the right lane, crossed the grass shoulder, and hit a tree with full forward momentum. Investigators compared the phone logs to the onboard data recorder and found both aligned within seconds. The last text transmission from either phone occurred at 3:10 a.m. The collision occurred less than 90 seconds later. Detectives at the scene collected both phones as evidence. When forensic technicians reconstructed the devices, they discovered that some messages had been manually deleted before impact. Using cloud backups, analysts restored partial content, confirming the deleted lines came from the same argument thread. Prosecutors later summarized that deletion as part of the evidentiary chain, suggesting consciousness of conflict. In interviews conducted while Leigha was recovering, detectives noted inconsistencies in her description of the moments before the crash. She initially told investigators she lost control while reaching for her phone. When confronted with event data readings showing sustained acceleration, she paused and said she didn't remember. FHP analysts labeled her statement non-corroborative with physical evidence. The vehicle's mechanical inspection showed no pre-impact failure. Tires intact, steering system operational, and throttle response normal. The absence of braking remained unexplained. According to the FHP reconstruction report, driver input was maintained until power loss at impact. Back in New York, Daniel's family received word that he was alive but critical. His mother later told local media that doctors couldn't explain the nature of the crash given the mechanical readings. To them, the data implied intent, but the law still required proof. By mid-February, investigators had reclassified the incident from traffic collision to criminal inquiry. That shift authorized access to telecommunications records, vehicle diagnostics, and digital cloud backups. The case file expanded from 21 to more than 100 pages within 2 weeks. Each added line drew the picture closer to motive. A late-night argument, a phone in her hand, acceleration where there should have been braking. It was now a matter of documentation, not suspicion. Investigators didn't need to prove anger, only control. Yet, in procedural terms, the file still carried the same label: single vehicle crash. No arrests, no charges, no indictment. The system couldn't act until medical condition or victim testimony allowed a sworn statement. That threshold, between suspicion and prosecution, became the waiting line for justice. One survivor was under sedation. The other was in recovery, and soon under questioning. When Daniel eventually opened his eyes weeks later, detectives would be waiting, because what began as data on a dashboard had now become a criminal narrative waiting for confirmation from the only person who had lived through it. By the third week after the crash, investigators had gathered enough digital and mechanical data to support a working theory. What they still lacked was a human statement from inside the car. That would arrive from the only surviving passenger, Daniel Waterman. Hospital records show Daniel regained consciousness at Halifax Health in early March. He remained on a ventilator and was unable to speak. Doctors described his condition as neurologically responsive but nonverbal. At that point, detectives from the Florida Highway Patrol requested permission to attempt a written interview. According to court filings reviewed by local media, Daniel used a letterboard to answer basic questions. He spelled out his own name, confirmed he was the passenger, and identified the driver as Leigha Mumby. When asked if she had lost control or meant to crash, he pointed to the word meant. Detectives documented the exchange in the official report and photographed each response for chain of evidence verification. Those sessions lasted only minutes at a time. Daniel's vital signs would fluctuate, forcing medical staff to suspend questioning. But over several days, he conveyed enough detail to establish intent from his perspective. Prosecutors later summarized his account as a direct attribution of intent by gesture and written indication. As news of his partial recovery reached New York, his family released a brief statement thanking investigators. They believed his words would settle the question that data alone could not answer. Yet inside the courthouse, attorneys debated how those words could be used. Florida's evidence code restricts unsworn or nonverbal statements when the declarant cannot later testify. Defense counsel would later argue that the method of communication, a patient pointing to letters, failed to meet reliability standards. For detectives, that legal nuance carried weight. A statement that felt like proof might not survive the courtroom threshold. They continued collecting corroboration. the event data recorder, the text thread, the deletion logs, and the mechanical inspection summary. Each element reinforced Daniel's account, but existed independently of it. Investigators needed the total picture, knowing any single piece could be ruled inadmissible. By late March, Daniel was transferred to a long-term rehabilitation facility. Medical updates described partial mobility returning in his hands, but continuing respiratory dependence. Prosecutors maintained contact through his family, hoping for a full verbal statement. He would never recover enough to give one. Within weeks, the case file expanded to include new laboratory confirmations and witness statements from roadside responders. The classification officially changed from crash with injury to criminal investigation, aggravated battery with a motor vehicle. Behind that bureaucratic update was the quiet acceptance that the victim had spoken, even if the justice system might never legally hear him. For the Waterman family, the process felt like progress. For investigators, it was only procedural momentum. Between those two versions of justice, the case moved forward, powered not by emotion, but by evidence written in data, in medical logs, and in a few fragile words traced on a hospital board. By early July 2025, the investigation that began as a traffic file had turned into a criminal case. Detectives submitted their findings to the state attorney's office for review, citing Daniel's hospital statement, digital records, and vehicle data as combined evidence of intent. On July 18th, court filings show prosecutors charged Leigha Mumby with reckless driving, causing serious bodily injury and aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. The vehicle itself was classified as the weapon. She was taken into custody shortly after release from medical care and later posted bond. The formal arrest affidavit outlined 3 key facts: full throttle, no braking, and a surviving witness who indicated it wasn't an accident. At that point, Daniel remained in rehabilitation in New York. Family members told reporters he was regaining limited speech but still dependent on respiratory support. They believed charges would bring closure. For them, the legal process had caught up with the evidence. But legally, the case had only reached its first stage. In Florida, aggravated battery required proof of intent to cause harm, not intent to kill. Prosecutors could not pursue homicide without a death certificate directly linking injuries to the crash. For months, the case stood frozen, charged, but not concluded. Investigators continued forwarding supplemental reports while the defense began filing motions to limit use of Daniel's hospital communications. On October 8, 2025, medical officials in New York confirmed Daniel's death. His parents notified Florida prosecutors the same day. An autopsy attributed cause of death to complications from trauma sustained in the February collision. Within days, the state reclassified the case again, this time as vehicular homicide, a second-degree felony carrying up to 15 years in prison. Mumby appeared by video for the amended charge and entered a plea of not guilty. Her bond remained in place. Defense attorneys repeated their challenge to the admissibility of Daniel's earlier statements, arguing they lacked procedural reliability. For his family, the development meant justice had moved forward, but only on paper. The same laws that upgraded the charge also limited how much of Daniel's voice could be heard inside a courtroom. It was a legal step forward and a moral step sideways. After the homicide charge was filed, the case against Leigha Mumby shifted from traffic court to the felony division of Florida's 7th Judicial Circuit. Investigators began consolidating the technical reports, witness interviews, and expert analyses that would define the prosecution's narrative. Each document reflected the same conclusion. The car had not malfunctioned. It had obeyed its driver. According to court filings reviewed by Fox 35 Orlando, prosecutors relied on 3 categories of proof. First, event data readings that showed full throttle with no deceleration before impact. Second, digital communication, including the recovered text exchange and deleted messages leading up to the crash. And third, post-crash statements, including Daniel Waterman's written responses, identifying Leigha as the driver who meant to do it. Together, those formed what the affidavit called a triangulated sequence of intent. The defense countered with its own procedural focus. Attorneys argued that Daniel's communications were unreliable due to medical impairment, and that emotional distress had compromised Leigha's state of mind. They did not dispute the data but questioned interpretation, suggesting she had reacted impulsively during an argument, not with premeditated intent. Under Florida law, that difference could shift a sentence from years to probation. FHP's mechanical report left little ambiguity. Every system in the car was functional at the time of impact. Investigators documented tire pressure, steering integrity, and engine diagnostics, each consistent with deliberate acceleration. The absence of braking remained the case's physical anchor. In the words of one analyst cited in the filings, the car responded normally. What failed was the decision-making. As forensic review continued, a separate proceeding emerged. Court records show Daniel's family petitioned for custody of the newborn child Leigha had given birth to months after the crash. The petition argued the child should remain with paternal relatives pending paternity testing. Defense attorneys filed an objection, citing Leigha's parental rights under state law. That family court case became a secondary battleground, mirroring the criminal one, evidence on one side, legal definition on the other. Prosecutors described the crash as a domestic act of violence executed through a vehicle, linking motive to the argument about fidelity and the pregnancy. They highlighted deleted texts as behavioral evidence, small acts of erasure implying awareness. Defense counsel responded that deletion alone proved nothing, and that emotional volatility during pregnancy should not be equated with homicidal intent. In early November, forensic analysts from the Highway Patrol completed their final reconstruction report. It contained more than 100 pages of timing charts, speed calculations, and throttle graphs. Every dataset returned to the same conclusion. The accelerator remained fully engaged until impact, with no secondary system interference. Prosecutors submitted the report as Exhibit A for upcoming pretrial. Behind those filings, the justice question deepened. Daniel's written statement, the one piece of human evidence aligning every technical point, remained under dispute. Under Florida's Evidence Code Section 90.804, statements from deceased witnesses are admissible only under narrow exceptions. Legal analysts told Flagler Live the defense had grounds to challenge it as hearsay. That single rule could silence the victim's only words from ever being presented to a jury. For the Waterman family, that prospect turned legal procedure into frustration. They had data, motive, and a documented statement, yet all could be argued away through statute. What the system called fairness felt to them like erasure. By mid-November 2025, the case was officially listed for pretrial review before Judge Dawn Nichols. The evidence table was set, one side anchored in data, the other in law. Both were factual. Only one could define justice. By late November 2025, the case file of State of Florida versus Leigha Mumby had reached the courtroom calendar. The pretrial hearing was scheduled for November 19th at the Kim C. Hammond Justice Center in Bunnell. Judge Dawn Nichols presided over the docket, assigning time for motions and discovery review. The hearing would decide what the jury would be allowed to hear, and what would remain outside the record. According to court minutes obtained by Flagler Live, prosecutors outlined 15 witnesses: Florida Highway Patrol crash analysts, paramedics, digital forensics technicians, and one attending physician from Halifax Health. Their goal was procedural clarity, to prove sequence, not speculation. Each would testify to a specific portion of evidence: the car's acceleration, the deleted messages, and the medical outcome. Defense attorneys filed motions to suppress Daniel Waterman's hospital communications. They cited Florida Evidence Code Section 90.804, arguing that his written and gestured statements failed to meet reliability standards for dying declarations. Without them, the jury would only see data, charts and graphs without the voice that linked them to motive. For prosecutors, that suppression motion became the central fight. The defense wasn't disputing what happened, only what could be legally said about why. Pretrial lasted less than an hour. Judge Nichols deferred a final ruling on admissibility until the start of trial, instructing both sides to prepare for opening statements in early 2026. Mumby remained free on bond under supervision. The court ordered she have no contact with the victim's family. Outside the courtroom, Daniel's parents spoke briefly with reporters. They described the hearing as the hardest kind of waiting, believing their son's testimony might never be heard in full. Public records confirm no plea agreement discussions were active at that point. The case was heading to trial exactly as it began, a collision of data, law, and loss. For investigators, the file was complete. For the family, it was still unfinished. The justice system had delivered process, but not resolution. Every motion and objection carried the same imbalance. Proof existing, but bounded by rule. As the year closed, the court scheduled jury selection for March 2026. The evidence would be presented, contested, and judged in order. Yet the question remained, if the truth exists, in forms the law can't admit, can the verdict still be called justice? Justice doesn't always end where it should. Some truths live inside evidence the law can't admit. And sometimes, the story a victim leaves behind never reaches the people meant to decide it. If you have followed this case, tell us what you think. Was this a crash or a choice? And where are you watching from tonight? If you want to hear more real cases told with every fact intact, subscribe to Crime Insider. And stay with us as we search for the truth that never made it to court.